What difference would it make to your life right now if you were able to cut the cost of your rent and bills in half? What would that feel like? I'll come back to that in just a moment. Over the last 40 years, average earnings in the UK have risen by around 43%. Now, that sounds like a great statistic by itself until you contrast that against the fact that house prices in the UK have risen by an incredible 1,010% during that same 40-year period. Already, there are some parts of the country where an average house price is more than 10 times that of an average salary. It doesn't take a mathematician to see that such disproportionate growth is just not sustainable. We need a new solution. For many, the path to achieve home ownership is slippery and challenging at best. For others, the prospect of even saving that all-important deposit can seem nigh on impossible. Instead, they are faced with a lifetime of being shackled to the tenancy treadmill. So what ends up happening is that people go after the money by pursuing careers which maybe pay well, but ultimately do not fulfill them. Many spending years or even decades stuck in a job they either dislike or despise. A job that's making them increasingly miserable, maybe even depressed. I know, because I was one of those people. A few years ago, I remember hearing Tony Robbins share a story about a study that was conducted to look at the number one reason why somebody would die from a fatal first heart attack. Dead and gone, no second chances. Now, you'd expect it to be heart disease, excessive smoking and drinking, right? But no. Those things were there, but the researchers discovered that the number one reason for dying from a fatal first heart attack was, in fact, job dissatisfaction. Now, just think about that for a moment. The number one reason you could die from a fatal first heart attack is job dissatisfaction. How does that happen? How do we end up trapped by our own actions, forced to live small, just to pay the bills and survive? So what happens when people feel trapped like that? Unfulfilled by their work, they tend to fill the void with stuff to distract themselves. But that doesn't work for long. So they buy more stuff and bigger stuff, but still the void remains. But by then it's too late. Maybe there's a couple of children in the picture by then. I mean, some couples, they've got 2 or 3 before they realize what's causing them. And by then, there's bills to pay, and rent to pay, and the credit card's due, and the car needs a new tire, and. How many people do you know who live their lives like that, paycheck to paycheck? Who do you know that always seems to be in a position of there being too much month left at the end of the money? So let's delve a little deeper for a moment into one of the biggest drains on our finances, and that's rent. How much does renting really cost? 500, 800, 1,000? Wrong. The real cost of renting is closer to £100,000. Now, I can see some quizzical looks in the audience right now, so let me quantify that remark. I'm not talking about the monthly cost. I'm talking about the fact that because house prices have become so disproportionate to earnings, that it now takes most people around 10 years of paying rent. 10 years before they can save up a big enough deposit to buy a house and escape the tenancy treadmill. That's 10 years of paying somebody else's mortgage plus profit. Now, you remember my opening question. What difference would it make to your quality of life right now if you were able to cut the cost of your rent and bills in half? For some, that might mean being able to leave that job they hate to go and find work which gives them passion and purpose, that truly makes their heart sing instead of sink. Perhaps it's a young couple who realize that by going tiny, they can afford to both work part-time and pay all the bills and both get to see their children grow up. Or maybe it's an older couple who decide to downsize to a tiny home, pay off the mortgage early, and that enables them to retire in their 50s instead of their 70s. Maybe there's even enough left over to go off traveling around the world for a year or two. Now, those are just a couple of examples of what I mean when I talk about living large by going tiny. And when I talk about going tiny, I'm also talking about simplifying your lifestyle to allow you to do more with less. And that doesn't mean sacrificing or missing out. Perhaps the best word to use here would be streamlining. Streamlining your possessions to allow you to glide through life instead of scraping by. It also means being aware that you have a choice. You can choose to surround yourself only with your favorite things. Personally, I became something of a minimalist by default, really, before I even knew that was a thing. I spent most of my working life away, not in prison, working away. As a result of having done so much traveling, I hadn't bought a home when I was younger, and so technically I was homeless for most of my working life. I'd always worked away, and those contracts came with accommodation included as part of the package. Buying a house? Yeah, that's something I'll get round to someday. But do you know what? Before I knew it, my 40th birthday was on the horizon, and someday was nowhere in sight. By which point, of course, house prices had become frankly ridiculous. That's when I began to realize just how expensive renting really is. How much richness in cherished memories of adventures and experiences I would have missed out on if I'd been constantly worried about paying the rent, especially when the cheapest place I could find to rent locally was far bigger than I needed. But you know, sometimes the struggle is in finding something affordable at all, because even that term has become distorted. Do you know what the official definition is of an affordable home in the UK right now? An affordable home is deemed such if it is 80% of surrounding market value. Now, the trouble with that statement is it's in no way linked to earnings. So if you happen to live in an area where an average house price is £250,000, which is most of the country right now, then by that same definition, a £200,000 home is deemed to be affordable. We need a new solution. We need to make buying a home genuinely affordable. A genuinely affordable home is within the reach of the man on the street and not just the elite. A home which anybody working full-time, earning minimum wage can afford to buy with ease. It was around that time that I discovered the tiny home movement around the world, and I realized what an incredible solution that could be for so many people. Because the cost of buying a tiny home is significantly less than that of a traditional full-size house, and so too are the running costs. And that's where the benefits of going tiny really begin to shine. From my own experience, I know that it's possible to live in a tiny home. In fact, it's not only possible, it's liberating. Letting go of the things that do not truly enrich your life means that you can move house with an estate car instead of a 7.5-ton truck or two. A tiny home could be a narrowboat, a container home, a motorhome, or even a geodesic dome. The size and shape, they don't really matter, as long as the benefits of going tiny work for you. It could be that a tiny home in the garden creates a dignified independence for an elderly parent who needs some extra support in their autumn years. Or perhaps a tiny home in the garden means that your son or daughter doesn't have to move away to be able to afford a place of their own. When it comes to possessions, it can be very easy to buy into the possessing of a thing, sometimes forgetting that the joy is not in the possessing. It's in the way a thing makes us feel. That's what gives anything real value. Does something have real value to you? Does it bring you joy? Great, then keep it. Material things can be wonderful, but only because of the function they perform or the way they make us feel. For example, I love quirky cars. I have two of them. Do I need two cars? Of course not. But they bring me joy. And so to me, they have value far beyond their material worth. Let me put it this way. If I won the lottery tomorrow, I'd still keep both of them because they bring me joy. And to my mind, those are the things to really hang on to. Those are the things to cherish. Now, being something of a minimalist means that a tiny home is a perfect choice for me because it allows me to cut my basic living costs in half. That means more disposable income, more freedom, more choice, but perhaps most importantly, less stress. When you're less stressed, your mental bandwidth is increased massively because your brain is no longer in survival mode. So to come back to the example of renting for a moment, let's imagine that you scrimped and saved and you managed to save your deposit in just 5 years instead of 10. That's still going to mean you've spent the thick end of £50,000 on rent. Now, just suppose for a moment you were in the market for a £50,000 car. Nice, right? If you had a good enough credit score, you could buy a £50,000 car with just a 1% deposit. What if you were able to buy a home in the same way? To be able to buy a home just as easily as you can buy a car on finance. I'm talking here about a rent-to-own model. A rent-to-own model would mean that you can move into your new home just as easily as if you were renting. But you're building equity from day one. All of a sudden, home ownership becomes much more accessible to everybody. Now, from an investor's point of view, they can still make a healthy rate of return on their property investment, but by sponsoring a rent-to-own purchase rather than a buy-to-let investment, the traditionally adversarial relationship between tenant and landlord is dissolved. Because now competition becomes collaboration without any of the costs or responsibilities of being a landlord. Again, another example of living large by going tiny. By creating tiny home communities, the benefits of going tiny are magnified further still, because now there are opportunities to share resources, tools, facilities, books, maybe even electric pool cars with so many working from home now. But the very act of sharing resources and facilities like that has a much deeper significance beyond the obvious and pragmatic money saving. It all serves to create and nurture a real sense of community and belonging. The kind of community spirit that our grandparents' generation would have taken for granted. And going tiny, it's liberating. It really is liberating because affordability no longer has to be your primary consideration when you're making decisions. That is what I'm talking about when I talk about living large by going tiny. I'm not suggesting that going tiny is a universal solution, simply that going tiny is a real-world solution to a universal problem.